The following program is brought to you by coronavirus and the newest in the beta coronavirus line, COVID-19. Coronavirus, bringing human misery for 8,000 years. And by the state of Wisconsin's prohibition on gatherings of more than 10 people. Wisconsin, forward. And by the faculty and staff of Lawrence University.
Hi, welcome to Historic Preservation Lesson 13 on Historic House Museums and Sites. Before we get into historic house museums, I want to first talk about what a museum is. A basic definition of a museum would be that it is an educational and or scholarly institution. Its purpose is to educate the public about a particular topic or place or time, and in many museums to provide resources for scholars who are interested in that particular period or place or time. Some museums are purely educational, others are purely scholarly, although educational is the primary kind of museum. Scholarly museums tend to be ones that are associated with professional organizations or even companies. And they're really for use of the members. There's a famous one in London, the Linnaean Society, that has many of Linnaeus, who came up with the Linnaean classification system of species, has his collections and other collections about systematics, about how you organize species. So they have plants and insects and birds and other things that show the diversity of life. And they're really for members of that scholarly organization, although they're open to other scholars, but it's not really a museum that the public would go into for educational reasons. In addition to being educational and scholarly institutions, museums have collections. And so there are lots of educational and scholarly institutions. Lawrence University is one. Museums have collections, and they tend to exhibit those collections, although scholarly ones may not. Those collections really make museums different because what they do is education through objects, through seeing things, through sometimes touching things. And so that makes this a different kind of educational organization or scholarly organization that provides scholars with tangible objects to study and individuals with tangible objects to look at and sometimes to interact with. Finally, museums curate the objects that they have in their collections to preserve them for the future, to preserve them for future scholars, to preserve them for future use in educational purposes. And we can think of these three as sort of the key pieces that form a museum. Educational, scholarly institutions with collections that they curate for the future. So let's try and clarify this with a few questions. One, is a zoo a museum? Well, a zoo is clearly an educational institution and a scholarly one. Many zoos have people who are doing research on the animals, doing behavioral research, genetic research. So in that way, a zoo is clearly a museum. Does a zoo have a collection? Well, yes, it has a collection of animals. But does the zoo curate that collection to keep it for the future? Because you're dealing with living things, the answer in that sense is no. But in another sense, many zoos try to have a breeding program so that the species that they represent, that they have, can continue. So maybe that is a form of curation. So we could see zoos as a kind of museum. Does a museum have to have a collection? Having a collection and curating it seems to be a key part of a museum, and yet we have places like here in town, the Children's Museum, that doesn't really have a collection. It uses objects to educate, but it doesn't really have a collection that is kept in perpetuity. That collection is intended to be used and then can be thrown out once its useful life is gone or once a particular exhibit is changed. So it's not really meant to be a permanent collection. It's a collection that is used to educate, but not to preserve. Does that make a children's museum like that a museum? And I have to say there are some children's museums with wonderful collections. The Indianapolis Children's Museum, for example, has wonderful collections, but many of them really just have objects that are transient, that are there just for education. Does that make a children's museum a museum? Well, teaching through objects maybe does. That's an interesting question, and this is actually a question that is a sort of central one in museum studies. Can a site or landscape be a museum? Well, let's talk about a battlefield, for example. That's an educational institution to teach the public about a battle. It's a scholarly place. There are scholars who do research on a battle. There are archaeologists, for example, who go out and retrieve material remains of the battle to see how that battle played out. There are certainly historians who go in and look at the battlefield to understand better how a particular battle played out. Is there a collection? Well, the battlefield itself can be seen as a collection, and in that sense it's like what I would like to have you think about as a historic house museum, that the house itself is a collection. So yes, the battlefield can be seen as a collection in itself. And is it curated? Well, we could say absolutely. We've talked about battlefields earlier in the class and how difficult it can be to maintain the atmosphere at battlefields. The reason for maintaining the atmosphere is in order to curate that landscape. So I would say that a site or landscape is certainly a kind of a museum. And finally, does a museum have to educate or do research in order to be a museum? Or can it just be a collection that is maintained in perpetuity? Well, there's a sticking point, I think. And there are collections out there that are maybe seen as museums. And so I'm thinking particularly of a place here in Wisconsin called the House on the Rock. It's kind of a crazy quilt of material that was collected by an individual over his lifetime and now is open to the public. But there really isn't a clear educational mission in that collection. And there's really no research purpose for the collection. It's just stuff that the person found interesting and collected. Is that a museum? Or is it just a collection of stuff? And I would argue that a museum really has to have an educational purpose or a scholarly purpose in order to be a museum, because that educational or scholarly purpose is the reason you have the collection. It's not just to have stuff. It is having stuff in order to provide a tangible visual way to give an education, to educate about something, or to have objects to do research on. Okay, given that, there's a particular kind of what's often called a historic house museum that I want to kind of discuss as a separate entity, and that really is what I would like to call a museum in a historic house, not a historic house museum. These are very common in small community and county historical societies, and what typically happens is that a prominent member of the community gives a house to the historical society to use as their office and their museum. And that's the case here. This is, if you can read it, the Owen Phillips Miles House, built in 1873, and this is in Mount Carroll, Illinois, which was the county seat of Carroll County And that county and this town was very prominent in the middle of the 19th to late 19th century. The reason for that was it's in western Illinois on spectacular farmland and has direct access to the Mississippi River. So farmers could produce bountiful crops and ship them throughout the country. There's also tremendous mineral resources in the area, so there was also mining that produced materials that, again, were easily shipped throughout the country. So there are a number of these beautiful, in this case, Italianate houses in the community, and this one was set aside for the future to preserve that period of time in this community. And it is a beautiful house. However, it's not really used as an historic house. There is, if you go in, there is discussion of the family that lived there and of the town. But it's more offices for the Historic Society and more of a museum. A good part of this house is actually set up with collections and exhibits. Those collections were donated to the museum by local people who brought their material in. And they do represent the community. But sort of like House on the Rock, it's not a systematic collection. It's really kind of an assembly of historic material from the area. But it doesn't provide a systematic collection for the purpose of education or for the purpose of research. It certainly can be used for education and research, but unfortunately here, there isn't a clear educational mission going through the exhibits of the collection. And although research might be possible, there's no ongoing research and no easy way to access the material, or actually it's not really fully cataloged, so it's hard to even know what's there. This is very common throughout the country. In fact, I think most counties have a place like this for their county historical society. In fact, Outagamie County, the museum is in an old Masonic lodge, a historic structure, although that museum has objects that are there for a clear educational purpose, and they collect actively for particular educational reasons rather than just taking whatever collections people give them. I wouldn't consider this really a true historic house museum. This is a collecting point for material from a region, and it's a house that represents an important person or time in a region. But to me, there's part of that systemic mission that drives the educational or scholarly purpose that makes a museum or a historic house museum a true historic house museum. There is a mission. There's a story that's trying to be told, and the collections and the house are there and are used to tell that story, to fulfill that mission. So a museum and a historic house, while valuable and important to the community, I don't really see as a historic house museum. So what is a historic house museum? Well, to me, it's a structure that embodies a period or a person or an event, and the focus of the house is to tell the story of that period or person or event. You can kind of think of this as actually criteria A, B, and C from the National Register. And so a house is listed on the National Register for a particular reason or a couple of reasons. A historic house museum you can think of as telling that story. The reason that this house was listed, and most historic house museums are National Register listed places. Usually historic house museums are owned and operated by a nonprofit or a municipality. They're not professionally owned and operated by a formal museum, which although those are nonprofits, they are operated by professionals as a formal museum. Historic house museums tend to be operated by a volunteer corporation or by a municipality. And that creates some systemic problems in historic house museums, particularly ones in terms of driving that educational mission and developing educational programming, and then also in terms of funding. Historic house museums are typically reliant upon volunteers, and many times they don't even have a professional staff member. It's all volunteer operated. That creates a problem again for historic house museums, because volunteers, while very well-meaning and hardworking, don't have the knowledge, education, or skills to really drive that educational mission, to curate the collections, to maintain them for the future. And so historic house museums, as a form of museum, have particular problems that make historic house museums very difficult to run and unfortunately very difficult to sustain over the long haul. Here's an example of a professionally very well-run historic house museum. This is Villa Louis. It's in Prairie du Chien, which is on the western edge of Wisconsin on the Mississippi River. This one happens to be operated by the Wisconsin Historical Society. It is the home of a very prominent family that began in Prairie du Chien as fur traders, continued becoming the captains of business and industry in the region, and in the 1890s they built this beautiful mansion as their home, and it displays their wealth in great opulence. This is the Gilded Age, and they are a great example, or this house is a great example of the opulence of that period. Like many, or maybe even most historic houses, the house is set up with period rooms, and they sort of are intended to be kind of a snapshot. Here you have a bedroom where a book is laid out, there's some packages that have come in, and you can think of this almost, it would appear as if the person was in that room and just had left, and you're kind of looking at the room as it would be at a snapshot in time. Here's the kitchen, and you can see there's some cookies on a plate. The kitchen seems to be set up for baking, and it's almost as if someone just finished baking cookies and then has gone to wash their hands or something, and you're walking into the room again like a snapshot in time. That's very typical for historic house museums, and it can be very effective in teaching about the time period or event or person. People go through museums in different ways. And there's typically three ways that people go through museums. One of them is in a very systematic way, where a person will go in and begin at the first exhibit and read about everything in the exhibit case and go very systematically and carefully through a museum. The other end are people like me who try and get almost an impressionistic view of the museum. They'll go in and they'll wander from case to case, looking at things that grab their eye, going back to things that they found interesting, but sort of just getting a sense of what's here, what's in here, and kind of going to objects that particularly attract them. In the middle, and the bulk of people that visit museums are ones who are interested in the objects and kind of wander around to some extent, but want some help in understanding what's there. Want someone to tell them what's going on with this object, what does it mean, why is it on display. So at Villa Louis there are two ways of going through the museum. One of them is to take a guided tour with docents who are in period dress and represent people of the late 19th century, and they sort of walk you through the story of the house. That's for those kind of middle ground people. On the other hand, you can go through the house by yourself. They have lots of material for you to read through as you go through the house for those people who want to very systematically go through and understand everything, but you can just wander the house, see what's there. So in this well-run historic house museum, they take into account the best practices of museums of how to show people, educate people about the house. They also have ongoing demonstrations of life in the house, and you can see here that this person is baking cookies. In fact, those may be the very cookies that were in the other picture. demonstrating parts of life in the late 19th century. And then they have lots of programming. They have programming in the form of classes that people can take, maybe on classes of baking on a wood stove. They have programming for children, including day camps, and programming that a kid can do if they're just coming to the house with their parents on a visit, that will help them to learn about the house in a way that helps differentiate different ages of learning in addition to different styles of learning. So again, there's lots of ways that a well-run historic house engages the visitors to educate them about the story that the house is trying to tell. Okay, take a short break, come back in a minute. And now, politically incorrect behavior.
All the world was gay, swinging on its way. Things were looking brighter day by day. Nothing ever wrong, life was just a song, till that Looney Tune came along. I'm going cuckoo, here comes the choo-choo. I'm so loony, touch me in the head. Please pass the ketchup, I think I'll go to bed. Am I the screwball fool? Throw me the 8-ball fool. Once I knew a thing or two, now I'm a buckaroo. Dinky, parley, woo-woo.
And we are back. So now we're going to talk about the value of historic houses, or the value of their educational purpose. The main reason that historic houses are a unique form of museum, a unique form of education and scholarship, is that they allow a visitor to feel, to smell, to touch history. Instead of just being told about an event or about a family or about a time period, the visitor gets to actually go in and see everything that's there. They get to smell maybe the cookies that are baking in the kitchen, or the smell of the wool carpeting, the smell of a fire in the fireplace. They get to touch the woodwork. They get to interact with the physical space in which an event took place, or in which a group of people lived. And that's a really important form of education. It's a form of education that really can't be done any other way. It gives a whole different way of learning about something. And that's really the point of a museum. Museums are a unique form of education because they allow a person to interact with an object, if only by seeing it. So a historic house museum really puts that into 3 dimensions. Not only are the objects there, but the entire space in which an event took place, or that represents a period. That gives context to the story. You don't just hear the story, you experience the space in which the story occurred. And that provides a much richer learning experience. In terms of providing a rich learning experience, there's a very important ongoing debate in the field of historic house museums about what I like to call the velvet rope approach or an interactive approach. The velvet rope approach is what's mostly done. In fact, probably 90% of historic house museums use that approach. And what that means is that you, for example, go up to a room, maybe like the rooms we saw at Villa Louis, to a doorway, and there is a red velvet rope across the doorway, and you stand and you look in and see things. The interactive approach would be that you walk right into the room, and you get to see the room in 3 dimensions, and even feel or sit in the furniture, lay down on the bed. That provides a much richer educational experience. However, at Villa Louis, for example, something like 90% of the furniture is original to the house. Do you really want people sitting on that furniture, interacting with it? What if things get broken? Well, you could get reproductions. and put them in the house. And then people can easily use them and you can replace them as needed. But does that give an authentic experience? You're not seeing the actual objects that were in the house, you're seeing reproductions. That's an ongoing debate. But the idea that the interactive experience is better than the velvet rope experience, I think, is pretty universally held. And so as we go forward, I think you'll see more and more historic house museums trying to wrestle with that balance between the velvet rope and the interactive experience. And at Villa Louis, there's a successful way of doing that in many historic house museums through these demonstrations and through the activities that are provided. There are lots of issues today that face historic houses, and one of the primary ones is declining attendance. Attendance at museums in general has gone down over the past several decades. But at historic house museums, it's really collapsed. And that's unfortunate because most historic house museums are more heavily dependent on entrance fees than other kinds of museums. Making things worse is that maintenance costs have been increasing. And a historic house museum is an expensive endeavor. Historic houses, by their very nature, are always declining, and the materials to maintain the house are very expensive, or can be very expensive. The craftsmen that are needed to maintain the house, even to, for example, replace a newel post in a staircase, are very expensive because they're specialized craftsmen. So at a time of decreasing attendance and therefore decreasing revenues and increasing maintenance costs, historic house museums have become really squeezed throughout the country. And unfortunately, many of them are closing. Another problem is a reliance on volunteers. Not that volunteers necessarily are a bad thing, and again, many volunteers are just wonderful, dedicated people. Many of the historic houses that are around today became historic houses in the period between when the National Historic Preservation Act was passed in 1966 and the bicentennial in 1976. That was a period of great interest in American history and in historic houses. And many of the historic houses we have today saw their birth, if not their opening, during that time period. The people who opened those houses, who gave the money to restore them, who were the volunteers and continue to be the volunteers, were young people at that time. Today they're getting old. And unfortunately, those volunteers have done a poor job in recruiting new volunteers to come in. So the core of volunteers running historic house museums is aging dramatically. And it's not entirely clear where the new volunteers are going to come from. It's all of these serious problems facing historic house museums, and again, most historic house museums are right on the edge of financial collapse, and many of them are actually closing. What do you do at that point? Well, one of the things is to hope some other organization might take it over. More often, however, they're sold to private families with a codicil that they maintain the Secretary's standards. And sometimes a codicil that they're open several times a year for people to come in. That's unfortunate, but it is the reality facing historic house museums today. The other unfortunate reality, and maybe one of the reasons that a lot of historic house museums are facing the problems they are now, is that they don't have a clear mission. They're not telling a clear story. At some level, that's because of the reliance on volunteers, that volunteers are not professionals in creating that clear mission for the property or that clear story. But more importantly, I think it's over time, the mission, the story gets lost. individual volunteers or groups of volunteers, given the time and new interests in society, shift the story. And you'll have some volunteers telling one story, some another, or even if they're on the same page, as the story shifts, the mission kind of becomes blurred. The story becomes blurred. And this is an ongoing problem with historic house museums and, in fact, all museums. The educational or research mission has to be very clear, and the story you're telling the public has to be very clear. Otherwise, people get confused, and then they stop attending. They don't see the purpose of going there. And this is a continuing problem for historic house museums. Another kind of historic house museum is what I call historic house sites. And these are typically an assemblage of historic houses brought together to provide easy access to a wide variety of structures. One of the most famous is Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan, that was created by Henry Ford, brought lots of houses together, largely important places of industry or the homes of important industrialists. One nearby here is Heritage Hill in Green Bay that assembled a group of houses that sort of trace the history of Wisconsin. And those can be very valuable in terms of providing a place where an individual can go and get an experience of lots of different houses. There's also some real benefits in terms of the finances in centralizing maintenance. So, for example, Heritage Hill has a historic carpenter full-time on staff so that they don't need to go out and hire specialists as things need to be maintained. It provides centralized administration, and often that provides the opportunity to hire professionals who can help to maintain the mission, help to maintain the volunteer organization, and all those things. And the volunteers are centralized. One group of volunteers might be interested in, for example, blacksmithing, which is very common at historic house museums, or printing, again, very common at historic house sites. And they'll volunteer for that, but they might volunteer for some other things. There might be volunteers interested in a particular time period. They'll volunteer at that house, and there'll be other volunteers at other places. So there's real benefits to this, but there are some drawbacks. And I'm going to point to Shelburne Museum. It's in Vermont, and it is one of the most famous and well-known historic house museums, also one of the most eclectic. They have, for example, a paddle wheel steamer as one of their houses. It's a collection of 39 buildings on 45 acres, so there's lots to see there. The buildings are well maintained. They have a great professional staff and lots of volunteers. And this particular historic house site uses some of those historic houses to have exhibits essentially as galleries for fine art, and there's a wonderful collection of Impressionist art, for example, there, of folk art, and there's a wonderful collection of folk art, weapons, and then a big collection of toys. So there's sort of a mix at this particular historic house site of the houses, of period life, and also of like typical standard museum things in terms of exhibits and objects. The problem with historic house sites, despite their many benefits and the ability to attract visitors much more easily than standalone historic houses, is that there is, when you bring a bunch of houses together, the loss of context, of association, and of ambiance. Houses brought to a historic house site are no longer on the National Register because they violate that basic context piece. They've been moved. They've been pulled out of their association. They've been pulled out of the ambience of the place. Another one is the sort of flip side, that for the visitor they create a false sense of place. Sherborne is not as bad as some others in this context, or not as problematical, because they don't really try and make a place. They make some places, there's a farm, there's a railroad yard, that are intended to illustrate something, but it's pretty clear that what they're trying to do is not to create a real community. Heritage Hill is a little more problematic in that it does seem, other than the very early places that are actually across a road, that they maybe are trying to represent a community as it might have existed, even though a lot of houses were brought in. And there are other historic sites that really try to portray themselves as a historic community, when in fact that sense of place is artificial. And one needs to be careful in that you're not misrepresenting to the public what actually is going on. And finally, just like historic house museums, when you have a group of buildings like this, you have to ask a purpose. What is the mission of bringing together all of those buildings? What is the purpose? This can be a real problem. You have the opportunity to get a really wonderful building, so you bring it in. Well, does it actually fit the mission? Is it part of the story you're trying to tell? And so historic house sites can really fall into an issue where they have the opportunity to get something great and they just bring it in because it's something great. But over time, that means the mission, the story will degrade. And again, that hurts the educational mission. It hurts attendance because people get confused. They don't know what's going on. Lots of issues with these sites. Okay. Oh, how are you? Just reading in your historic preservation book a couple of interesting quotes. And I'll start with one that's on page 319, right at the end of the first paragraph. Interpretation is a mission-based communication process that forges emotional and intellectual connections between the interests of the audience and the meanings inherent in the resource. Interpretation. A mission-based communication process. I think that's one of the things that we find often gets lost in historic house museums and even in historic sites, interpretive sites, living history museums, is that the mission, what is the mission, what is the purpose of that museum, of that historic house? What narrative, what lesson is it trying to convey? That process of communicating that mission should forge an emotional and intellectual connection. And that's one of the things we've talked about too, how an historic house museum allows one the sensory feel, ambiance, smell of a place. Without the mission, what's the value of that feel, that ambiance, the ability to step into history? Without a mission, is there any benefit in doing that? It's an interesting question, and I hope that you'll think about it.